Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for braving the government shutdown to enter the very much open Woodrow Wilson Center and join us for this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar. My name is Eric Arneson. I'm from George Washington University. And I'm here this afternoon co-chairing with Philip Strum, representing the Wilson Center. The seminar, as many of you know, is a joint effort of the Wilson Center in the History and Public Policy program, and then the American Historical Association's National History Center. And we have been doing this jointly now for a good number of years. I'd like to thank the folks who, behind the scenes, make this seminar come off. We have Amanda Perry from the National History Center, and Pete Bierstecker, and Kian Byrne, who help us pull this off week after week. Also want to thank the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, Schaefer, as well as the Department of History of the George Washington University for their ongoing financial support for this seminar. We depend entirely upon donations to pull this seminar off, and should you wish to join the ranks of anonymous or not anonymous donors, we would be very much appreciated. If you have one of these devices, if I could ask you to put it into silent or vibrate mode so it will not go off at some inopportune moment over the next hour and a half. And now, Philippa will introduce our speaker, Sheryll Cashin, this afternoon.
Thank you, Eric. It's really my great pleasure to introduce Sheryll Cashin, who's a professor of law at Georgetown University. She got a master's degree in English law with honors from Oxford University, graduated with a JD with honors from the Harvard Law School, but the part of her education that I find most intriguing was she graduated summa cum laude from Vanderbilt University with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. So this is a woman of many parts. After Harvard Law School, she went to clerk for Judge Abner Mikva of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, and then for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. She was subsequently an advisor in the Clinton White House on urban and economic policy, and is the author of books including a book called The Failures of Integration, which was an editor's choice of the New York Times Book Review, a wonderful memoir kind of book called The Agitator's Daughter, a memoir of 4 generations of one extraordinary African-American family, which is indeed her family, and then Place Not Race, a new vision of opportunity in America. And of course, Professor Cashin has contributed articles to academic journals and to more popular venues like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. But she's going to be speaking with us today about her new book, which is Loving Interracial Intimacy in America and the Threat to White Supremacy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Cashin.
Thank you so much, Philippa, for a very generous introduction. Happy Shutdown Monday. I really appreciate your coming out. I want to preface my remarks by saying I'm getting over a pretty bad cold, and I'm going to try not to have a coughing fit, but if I do, I hope you'll forgive me. Thank you so much to the National History Center and the Wilson Center. It's truly an honor to be asked to participate in this history series. I'm a lawyer, a law professor. I'm not a trained historian, but I absolutely love history, and I think that will come out in this talk I'm going to give about the Loving case. I'm going to tell you a story about America, and I teach this course called Race in American Law, in which my students and I read most of the seminal race cases decided by the Supreme Court, and Loving versus Virginia, decided in 1967, is one of them. And I knew that the 50th anniversary of this opinion was coming, and I thought that it would be kind of a refreshing way to reflect on where we are with race relations in America and how we got there. So, I I'm going to tell you a story about America and its long history with race mixing and white supremacy. And it is a story with villains and saints, sometimes in the same person. I'll leave it to you to decide who was the villain and who was the saint as I go through this. In the beginning, in the American colonies, there was no concept of race or whiteness among struggling people. Sure, economic elites carried the idea of Christian European supremacy in their heads, an idea harkening back to the Crusades and justifying European conquering of so-called infidels. But in early colonial Virginia, among struggling people, they were likely to be allies. They would get drunk together, steal hogs together, run off to the Indians together to escape harsh servitude, have sex, sometimes get married. And for the first 6 decades in the colony, such fraternization was common. Perhaps the most iconic example of cross-racial love and alliance is in the story of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. We like this origin myth about America. It suggests benevolent cooperation, even love between pale and red people. But in the telling of the story of Pocahontas and John Rolfe and their marriage, storytellers rarely mention that Pocahontas was a prisoner of war in the colony for a year, and that was the context in which she met John Rolfe. She accepted his proposal of marriage, perhaps out of love, but also possibly as a way to negotiate peace between her people and her father's people, the indigenous nations of the Powhatan Confederacy, and the English colonists. And initially, for a little while, this worked, but this peace would prove ephemeral. English colonists conquered and killed natives because they wanted their lands. The ideology of supremacy of the Christian European would also be critical to this conquest, critical to justifying it. And this early construction of the supremacy of the Christian European would ultimately justify later other systems of oppression, from Mexican conquest to slavery to Chinese exclusion and on. But first, this ideology had to be taught to non-elites. And for the first century in the colonies, by far, the largest population of bonded people were white. Tobacco, a finicky plant, required much labor to produce a market. And when the investor class decided to transition from indentured white servitude to black chattel slavery, they had a problem. This habit of alliance among the black, white, and indigenous people who had toiled alongside each other. That habit of alliance had to be broken. There was a small population of Indian slaves as well as black slaves. The Indian slaves tended to be the spoils of war. All right. One form of alliance that was particularly dangerous to the slave-owning class was revolt. Most famously, Bacon's Rebellion. And it's a complicated story. You may not be able to see this, but the graphics aren't too great, but these are Indians, right? You have it. For 9 months in Virginia, you had an armed biracial uprising. 6,000 Europeans, 2,000 Africans with guns. First they go to try to kill Indians on the perimeter because they wanted their land, and then they start shooting at the elites. This biracial rebellion from 1676 sent shockwaves through the colonies. And this brings me to my first key point. And if you remember nothing else about what I say today, please remember this. Whiteness was created to solve a class conflict between wealthy planters and poor white servants. It had a political function to divide and conquer. And this legacy of dog whistling, divide and conquer, continues to this day. Colonial plutocrats, those that could afford to own a body or a contract attached to one, created a color line by elevating indentured whites, giving them certain protections against harsh treatment and other benefits, while stripping black slaves of those privileges that they had previously enjoyed. And I tell stories about interracial couples as well as interracial allies, particularly to show what early colonial Virginia was like. And one of my favorite stories, which legal historians are very familiar with, legal historians of this period, is a story about a guy named Tony Longo and his English wife, Hannah. Tony Longo, his real name Antonio, I believe, was one of the original 20 and odd slaves that arrived in Jamestown in 1619. He started out, he was an Angolan, a very skilled cattleman, and he, although he started out a slave in the colony, by the mid 17th century, we find him in a court case. He's a free man. He owns 250 acres of land. He had been able to hire himself out and acquire property. And he's quite an uppity black man. And in this case, he gets charged with assault. He's in his field alongside his wife, working and minding his business, and along comes a white colonist who's serving a subpoena on him because he wants him to come and testify on his behalf before a judge. And he says, no, go about your business. I'm busy. And the guy goes and gets the judge and reads the warrant to him in front of the judge, and he says, and I'm quoting from the case, shit of your warrant, right? Go about your business. And then he starts hitting him and giving him blows. And this attests to the egalitarian possibilities. Even for a black slave, you could become free, buy your freedom, marry a white woman. He ends up getting the same penalty in this case that anyone would for assault, 30 lashes. And I show other examples like this. Well, the first comprehensive slave code written by Virginia's legislators included a penalty against interracial sex and marriage. And for the next 300 years, Virginia in particular, relentlessly policed this line to protect an artificial white purity. And I feature some of this divide and conquer politics in the book, and really underscore what I call the sheer Strom-Thurgoodness of American hypocrisy here. And who embodies this, right? Our good friend Thomas Jefferson, right? He embodies America's incongruities. I'm not just picking on him alone. Here's the man who authored the beautiful words of the Declaration of Independence, and the idea of these self-evident truths about universal human equality, which have become a fundamental American value. He also wrote words in Notes on the State of Virginia that trade in white supremacy and apologize for, if not justify, black slavery. In Notes on Virginia, how many of you read Notes on Virginia? Anybody? Okay. Right. Encourage you to read it, at least excerpts. He worried aloud about the risks of, quote, amalgamation, unquote, of whites and blacks, and suggested that such mixture would stain white people and the country. Thomas Jefferson couldn't imagine a country where whites would accept blacks as citizens, much less intermix with them. And that's exactly what the early colonial life had been like. Blacks were able to become full subjects of the Queen with certain rights and mix with whites. And yet, even though Jefferson couldn't imagine this, he fathered 6 children with Sally Hemings. Other political figures through the ages also struggled with this challenge of how to protect whiteness while dealing with the fact that this expanding nation was populated from the beginning with peoples of color. And they had to deal with the fact that with proximity, there was always mixing in this country. Poor Abraham Lincoln, I featured this. He would face explicit dog whistling in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and especially in his re-election campaign of 1864. He was the victim of fake news. You may have heard about this, right? Jefferson used the word amalgamation, but the campaign of 1864 created a new word, miscegenation. Democrats created a hoax pamphlet that coined this word miscegenation. Misere, to mix, genus, race. The purpose of this pamphlet was to create the impression that the Republicans were actively promoting race mixing. The not so subtle message was that if you voted Republican, your daughter or son would end up having sex with a black person. And this spawned propaganda. You can't see it, but if you Google miscegenation ball, there's some very rude things going on in this slide, right? So there was a whole cottage industry of imagery, paraphernalia, suggesting this. And this was the white supremacist first and oldest wedge issue, right? If you vote for the anti-slavery new anti-slavery Republican Party, that's going to lead to abolition, which is going to lead to free black men roaming around and ultimately having sex with your daughter, right? That was the fear tactic. Yet, in every era, there were ardent integrators that defied lines to love or make alliance with people of color. And I feature examples throughout the book. I've told you about Tony Longo and his wife Hannah. Another example that I came across, which was a real hoot, was Richard Mentor Johnson, the 9th Vice President of the United States. You've probably never heard of him. He was married to a slave named Julia Chin. He had a common law marriage with her. He inherited this mulatto slave from his father and fell in love with her, fathered children with her, married his I guess, octoroon or whatever, but his very light but mulatto daughters off to respectable white men, and this caused a complete kerfuffle which was commented on throughout the nation. I feature Mary Todd Lincoln and her best friend, a seamstress, former slave Elizabeth Keckley. And then I feature some of my favorite people, radical Republicans. This is Thaddeus Stevens and his housekeeper, probably his common law wife, a mulatto woman named Lydia Smith. He never owned up to it, but he never denied it either. They certainly shared the same house. If you saw the movie Lincoln, they have someone playing her in the last scene. A cistern in their house was part of the Underground Railroad. They were post-station agents. And basically, this woman ran Thaddeus Stevens' life. And he always insisted that everyone address her by her proper name, Mrs. Lydia Smith. She was a widow. The other person I feature, my man Frederick Douglass, who was really a magnet for white spinsters who were wowed by his intellect. It was quite something. I feature some of these women. But what was interesting about Douglass, with his newspapers and his advocacy, he was the center of a network of interracial allies, right? And and some of these women were his lovers, and Helen Pitts becomes his wife. But Frederick Douglass is utterly emancipated, defied color lines. A final example I'll give, which comes from the late 1800s, 1883, a case called Pace v. Alabama, which is kind of like the Plessy v. Ferguson of anti-miscegenation law. It involves a black man, Tom Pace, who was living with a white woman, Mary Jane Cox, ostensibly as man and wife, in a little tiny hamlet in West Alabama in the 1880s. They end up both being prosecuted under an anti-miscegenation law which penalized interracial sex, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically says this law does not violate the Equal Protection Clause because both the white woman and the black man got 2 years. It's formal equality, right? So I confess with these examples that I'm personally attracted to characters who subverted this ideology that told whites in particular that you could not marry, have sex with, live near, play checkers with, much less an ally in politics with people of another race. This is what plutocrats have always feared in this country. Every time you have an assertion or a reassertion of whiteness, there is an economic story of elites trying to stop struggling people of all colors from allying to demand more of wealthy people. This happened in the wake of Reconstruction. One of the first examples in the world of robust biracial democracy. Reconstruction was utterly radical. 700 men of color, including, I'm proud to say, my great-grandfather, served in legislatures of the former Confederacy alongside whites loyal to the Union. And together, they create public education for the first time in the South. They adopt constitutions with a vision for an integrated society. It's questionable, you know, and some Republicans were more radical than others, but most of the southern states repealed their anti-miscegenation laws during Reconstruction. Certainly, the radical Republicans had a vision for integrated politics. At this Reconstruction, this radical vision drove some men mad. I mean, literally, I think mad. Supremacists immediately, during Reconstruction, create the myth of the black sexual predator as part of the dogma to destroy Reconstruction. It made no sense, but black men voting and holding office was as provocative as the idea of them having sex with white women. And this trope animated the passion play of lynching. This is a scene from Birth of a Nation, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Sorry, Woodrow Wilson fans. I mean, we all know this is, you know, all historians know this. He allowed this film to be played at the White House. This film was directly responsible for the rebirth of the Klan. And in this infamous movie, you can see the association between black political engagement and interracial sex. In one scene, white men in blackface play the roles of black legislators as buffoons who put their feet on the desk and eat chicken in the halls of the Southern legislature. In another scene, a man in blackface chases after a white woman, a white Southern magnolia, and she leaps to her death rather than be ravished by a black man. And if you think this dogma is old stuff, it is not. It is currently being used by domestic terror cells. Recall the tragic words of Dylan Roof, who murdered 9 black parishioners after they welcomed him at their Wednesday night Bible study. He said, "They are raping our women." White supremacist groups are actively using this old stuff about interracial sex to lure, I guess I would say, the more fragile of white millennials. Old story, despicable story, and yes, casting Mexicans as rapists when you announce that you're running for president is of a piece with this dogma. All right. In the same era when this film was screened, there was a rise of eugenics. The idea that we could engineer better human beings by controlling births by undesirable populations. And Virginia in particular was a hotbed of eugenic thinking when its legislature adopted the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This law tightened the definition of whiteness. I said Virginia was first. Virginia in the late 1600s adopts the first penalty on interracial sex, and for the next 300 years, it keeps defining and refining the color line, penalizing people who cross it, particularly for sex or marriage. And the 1924 law tightened the definition of whiteness and banned whites from marrying anyone who was not 100% white. How do you suppose you would prove that you were 100% white? As we know, there's no scientific basis for race. It's been completely debunked. It is utterly a social construction. It would be rather difficult, if not impossible, for anyone to prove that they were racially pure. If you haven't done it, I encourage you, take a DNA test. You may be surprised at what you find, right? But that didn't stop Virginians from trying. And there was one exception to the white racial purity in the law, the so-called Pocahontas exception. Pocahontas and John Rolfe had a son named Thomas Rolfe, and many of Virginia's most aristocratic families descended from him, including Woodrow Wilson's wife. And so the racial integrity law allowed those with no more than 1/16 Native American heritage to claim whiteness. Otherwise, a white person like Richard Loving was barred from marrying any non-white person. And this is a love story. If you see the movie, how many of you seen the movie? Okay, a fair number. It's a very sweet movie, and it's pretty accurate. I could quibble about something, but it's pretty accurate. But this couple, Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving, lived in a little hamlet, Central Point, in Virginia, that had a long history of mixing among whites, blacks, and Native Americans, going all the way back to colonial times. My father, who was very funny, would say there was a lot of nighttime integration in Central Point. And what Richard was doing was particularly upsetting to the white men in the county. They didn't mind. A lot of white men in the county apparently had a Negro woman on the side. What he did was he was breaking the rules by wanting to marry the woman he loved. Loving versus Virginia was the first case in the history of the Supreme Court in which the court explicitly writes that the law that they're reviewing was designed to promote white supremacy. Chief Justice Warren said it twice. Twice, the court, in a unanimous opinion, names the ideology that the Civil War and the 14th Amendment was supposed to have ended. And perhaps Chief Justice Warren thought being transparent about this pervasive racial dogma would help cure the nation of this mental illness. The long, hot summer of 1967 had already begun when the court issued its opinion on June 12th. By the end of the year, 159 riots had roiled the United States, most lethally in Detroit, where a police raid on an after-hours bar had set off a 5-day revolt that ended in 43 deaths and 2,000 injuries. Well, the Loving case struck down legal barriers to interracial intimacy, but its true import is only beginning to be felt, I believe, as social barriers to cross-racial intimacy are eroding. And in the book, I depict 5 forms of interracial intimacy that are accelerating right under our noses. And I speculate about the future impact of this mixing on American identity and politics. Here are the 5 forms. Marriage and cohabitation, that's one. Dating, adoption, friendship, and a 5th form of intimacy that social psychologists call parasocial relationships. This is the family from the very popular show Blackish. About 80% of the audience for that show is white. And social psychologists have shown that it's possible through media to develop affectionate ties with a character of a different race, or say, a black president of the United States, in ways that have been shown to reduce prejudice and that humanize people who are different. This is the family watching the 2016 election returns. Each of these forms of intimacy transfers what I call cultural dexterity, a phrase I coined. What is cultural dexterity? It is the opposite of colorblindness. It is the seeing of racial and ethnic difference and accepting it, if not loving it, rather than demanding that someone assimilate to your own culture. I'll tell you, my argument is that cultural dexterity is spreading through these forms of intimacies. About 1/5 of new marriages and cohabiting couples are interracial in this country. 1/4 of all adoptions in this country are between a parent and a child of a different race. The number 2 country internationally for Americans to adopt from now is Ethiopia, or at least the last time I looked at the data. And much of this cross-racial adoption is happening in red states. Who knows who this family is? It's one of the Duck Dynasty sons. Grandfathers are rabid racists. But in a lot of red states, because evangelicals and other faith groups are promoting international adoption of orphans, I featured this in the book. Some of these pastors at mega churches, this one guy says, you know, the biggest problem I have is these white mothers coming to me crying about how to deal with racism against their black Ethiopian sons. They're waking up to the reality that their son could be perceived as Trayvon, right? And, you know, I'm ambivalent about this, but it's happening, right? Marriage actually may be the least impactful forms of intimacy because fewer people, frankly, are marrying. I actually think friendship may be the most impactful because the barriers to entry are much lower than with marriage or adoption. And this, I think, is a radical point for older people in the room, and I include myself in that group, right? Most millennials have at least one authentic friend, someone they actually spend time with and talk to, of a different race. Their grandparents, not so much. In fact, that was, you know, that just didn't happen in their grandparents' generation, right? And this is Perpetua Charles. She's a staff person at Beacon Press. She wrote, after she read my book, she wrote a very interesting piece about her best friend Clara. They met in college and became roommates for 3 years. And she writes about their journey of when all the Black Lives Matter stuff was exploding, of the real challenge they had in talking about that in a way where Clara could really hear her perspective without defensiveness. Well, recent research shows that if a white person is friends, particularly with a black American, that predicts greater empathy regarding what black people experience, which in turn feeds into greater anger regarding how black people are treated, which in turn predicts greater support for and participation in collective action for racial justice. You know, and I often tell young audiences, particularly, as bad as things are, and I acknowledge things are pretty awful right now, we have toxic polarity in this country, 60% of whites under 30 agree with the Black Lives Matter movement and its critique of law enforcement. I conclude with a chapter about the future. And I explain, it's a tipping point theory borrowed from Malcolm Gladwell, where he says we need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that sometimes big changes follow from small events, and sometimes these changes can happen very quickly. My analogy is to the run-up in change of attitudes around same-sex marriage. In the 2010s, we went to a country in a 5-year period where a majority of people were against it, to a majority of people were for it. Now, if you take the long view, that struggle started, you know, at least back in 1969 with Stonewall uprisings, right? But we got to the point where, because acceptance spread as straight people had conversations with gay people or their allies about their hardships and their dreams for equality. And attitudes about race, I think, have the potential to undergo exponential change in coming decades. I will say for Q&A, you know, I have some doubts about this, and I can tell you what my doubts are, and some cautions about the challenges. But while I have no hope for a class unity emerging among struggling people of all colors, in part because of union busting and gerrymandering and the effectiveness of dog whistling, one thing that gives me optimism is that this cultural dexterity is spreading. And I take heart, in particular, I offer the example of California. The example of California helps me, the engineer in me, right, the empiricist in me, the scientist in me, believe in what I'm saying. In a 20-year period, California went from being majority white to gridlocked to majority minority to functional again in its politics. In the late 1980s, Pete Wilson campaigned for re-election for governor with the same kind of anti-immigrant fear-mongering that Donald Trump rode to the presidency. Now, he was much more eloquent, you know, but it was the same kind of stoking of fear, right? But California changed because the people who comprised a political majority in that state changed. Through a confluence of factors, what political scientists call a coalition of the ascendant emerged, such that that kind of dog whistling is now a non-starter in statewide politics in California. Okay, so what were some of the factors, the confluence, the perfect storm? Rates of interracial intimacy in that state were much higher than the national average. We're at like 1/5 of couples, 1/4 of couples are interracial there. They also had some slowly rising rates of residential integration. The other factor is that Pete Wilson accelerated the political engagement of the fastest growing populations in the states. Latinos, Asians, multiracial people. People who experience discrimination, don't like it, and felt motivated not just to register to vote, but to run for office, right? And the silver lining with this president, I think, is he's accelerating the exact same processes here, nationally, right? Muslim Americans, immigrants, people who don't like being scapegoated, and people who don't like seeing other people scapegoated are getting more engaged with politics and activism. And I do say that activism is required. This is a time of choosing. This is not a time to be sitting on the sidelines. I think it's, you know, we're in an existential period and you have to decide what kind of America you want to live in. But, you know, the other thing that happened in California, the dying off of older generations of whites that grew up expecting to be dominant. Meanwhile, younger whites, millennials, are more accepting of diversity. So California adjusted, they ended gerrymandering, they put districting in the hands of a bipartisan citizens commission. Today, California is retreating from the war on drugs, investing in education, leading on climate change, and it's an example to the rest of the country of what a functioning multiracial democracy looks like. And of course it's not perfect. There's still a lot of damage to undo. But those with faith in a greater idea than the nasty politics we've been treated to of late can rewrite a new narrative. It requires acceptance, though, of the self-evident truth of our founding. If all are created equal, then America should not have been constructed as a white country. Imagining how the culturally dexterous, tolerant people, the Ascendant Coalition, could renew or reconstruct America to help this great nation live up to its professed ideals brings a smile to my face. If we want things to be better, we have to allow ourselves to envision a more beautiful America. I often say optimism is a choice. The forces of darkness want you to be broken down and so depressed that you can't get out of bed. I think optimism is a choice, but I also believe in this case that it's an informed one. With faith in a better future, we can all get up every day and fight for the country we deserve. Thank you.
I'm going to guess that there are going to be some questions. Please wait for the microphone to reach you. Please identify yourself, and please use the microphone. We'll start here in the middle, and we'll work our way up. Go second.
Stephen, your wonderful talk. There are 2 points I wish you'd go into greater detail about. I mean, granted that this was something we talk about in other talks here about American exceptionalism, of why the United States is the only industrialized nation without a true left-wing political party. And race may be the answer on this question, but how much was it a deliberate strategy among the elites to cultivate, break the bonds between people of the same social class, regardless of color? And even if it was deliberate, did the elites who manipulated this not share the same prejudices? In other words, did they secretly believe in equality but found it politically expedient to push racial inequality, or were they themselves victims of the same racist delusion as the white working class people they try to manipulate?
As a general matter, certainly throughout history, most whites accepted in the dogma of white supremacy. That's it had to be created and constructed, but that's the reality. It's not a happy story, right? Most of our founding fathers, not all of them, but most of them, at minimum they were ambivalent, but most of them believed in the idea that the white race was superior. That was the central organizing principle for the Democratic Party from Reconstruction forward for 100 years. I'm from Alabama. As late as 1966, my father told me. You walk into the voting booth, and the formal slogan above the Democrats' white rooster was white supremacy for the right? So that was the pervasive idea. But what I tell my students is, the Civil Rights Revolution did, in one generation, take us from a country where most whites believed in or acquiesced in that dogma to where most whites rejected it, right? And until this last election, I would have said, you know, this idea of supremacy is dead. I would have said that, right? But what I still, you know, 54% of the electorate voted for someone other than Donald Trump. So I still believe that the majority of whites, I don't know what I think is going on with elites is a cynical thing where they just don't want to pay their fair share of taxes. They just don't want to, right? And they will do things to hold on to their money and their power regardless of how they feel about race, right? So I don't think I can say something monolithically about that. I know that the elites in the colonial Virginia had this idea of the superiority of the Christian European. But my main message to people is that white people are not a monolith. I don't think it's racist and non-racist so much as dexterous and not dexterous. Those who fear the future and those who welcome it. And it's much easier to stoke fear than to build alliance, unfortunately.
James Banner. Professor Cashin, I came here, particularly given the title of your book, thinking that you would lead us through a history of the constitutional law of interracial marriage. I'm sort of interested in the pleadings of the two attorneys who argued this case, who live nearby.
Mm-hmm. So you're a law nerd.
Deceased, I think, and one lives nearby. But at any rate, could you give us a very short course on how the constitutional law of interracial marriage changed?
Yes.
Because certainly the Loving case is one of the great decisions in civil law of the 20th century. How did we get there?
So Loving was preceded, obviously, by Brown v. Board, right? So the court had already rejected Plessy versus Ferguson. Loving was sort of like the last plank, the only. We'd also had a civil rights revolution, and we had the Civil Rights Acts, right, and the Voting Rights Act. So this ban on interracial marriage, which was the Supreme Court had passed on the opportunity to opine on that earlier because it was something that people weren't comfortable touching. It was like the last plank of the formal Jim Crow regime that was left. And basically, Chief Justice Warren invoked both the equality dimension of the 14th Amendment and the liberty dimension.
But had those been mentioned earlier in the 20th century in the other cases?
Well, you know, even Plessy versus Ferguson claims that they were according formal equality to black people, right? So the Supreme Court had always claimed to be supporting this equality dimension. But they came up with this fiction of formal equality and refused to name the social reality that separate public accommodations had, separate schools and everything. Brown is the beginning of the court naming what everybody knew was the social reality of the color line. Separate was inherently unequal and implied inferiority of black people. So the court, frankly, became, and I should say, the boss, Justice Marshall, who I worked for, with the brilliant work of the NAACP lawyers, they kind of forced the court into this position of being intellectually honest about the social reality. And Loving was sort of the completion of that, I guess, in some way, by saying, this is about white supremacy, we can't have this anymore. I don't know if that's satisfying to you. I'm happy to give you a sidebar conversation. I was warned that not everybody who comes to these things is lawyers, so I was speaking to a broader audience. So.
Professor Cashin, first of all, thanks for the presentation. And for any of you who are interested in colonial history, you need to get this book. because I told her before we started, it is just wonderful. The colonial history generally, and as somebody who taught this in part for a long time, I learned things from her coverage of it. So a lawyer who switches over to become an historian for this purpose, very impressive altogether. I mean, here we talk about history and public policy. And so I want to push you a little bit on the public policy implications of what you say. In the book, you talk about the increasing diversity in large cities, the increasing racial diversity and other diversity in large cities, but the remaining racism in the heartland. And I'm wondering to what extent we might be looking at a real divide between cultural realities and public policy, simply because that heartland is not going to give up its 2 senators per state. We've got the Electoral College, and because of the disparities in democratic practice, I guess you could say, it seems to me that the prognosis for enlightened public policy is not as good as the prognosis for cultural change. So what do you think about that?
So this gets to the doubt I have. I allowed myself to speculate about how this could turn out better. I could have also written a more dystopian take, because again, it's much easier to stoke fear. Donald Trump won in counties that had very few immigrants, very few people of color. So these are not folks that that live a daily life where they have a lot of people of color in their lives, right? So we are in this period of what we really have is a clash of worldviews and a class of cultural worldviews. And we have these silos where, people, it's just so cheap and easy to stoke fear about people who are different for ratings or for votes, than to, especially if the goal is to deliver public policies to your donors, to deliver the public policies that extremely affluent people want, right? So the one doubt or caution I have about my prediction is gerrymandering could hold in place the disproportionate power of white rural voters. But I'm heartened because, the Supreme Court case, I do think Anthony Kennedy is going to deliver a standard before he retires that enables people to sue in every state in the country to say this is extreme partisan gerrymandering. And then the game is up, right? Because, right now, the popular majority is for very common sense things, like common sense gun control, but you can't get it through Congress. So, I don't know if that's responsive or not, but.
We're both feeling a little bit ambivalent.
Well, like I said, the tipping point theory, you see I put that date on there, I just speculated, 2030, eat your chia seeds, right? You gotta live to see this progression. But I think, again, but for the Electoral College, which was put in place to benefit slave-owning states, right, which is a concession to the regime of white supremacy and slave owning, we would have a very different situation. I think there's a critical mass of whites now that accepts the loss of centrality of whiteness, that wants to be part of a broader coalition for sanity and fairness for regular folk. But we're still being stymied by these structural things like gerrymandering. So.
There was a hand in the far back. The microphone is coming.
Howdy, Tristan Martinez. In Hispanic culture, we have a concept of mejorar la raza, always improve the race. and it's inherently prejudiced to try to integrate into a white man's world. So always look for marrying to a white family if you can. Recently, I've been seeing a lot of pushback against it, which is good, trying to celebrate our own uniqueness, but it's also difficult to keep advancing integrationist policy when we have a very prejudiced cultural system enforcing the integrationist policy. How would you suggest, if you would suggest, continuing integration for Hispanic community and as a community of color, while celebrating our individual and cultural differences? Thank you.
Very interesting question. First, I want to make clear that in the history of this country, well, we had miscegenation laws that banned whites from marrying blacks, and some states Asians, a few states indigenous people. We never had laws banning marriage with Hispanics. And in part, that intermarriage was encouraged. 1/3 of the continental United States used to be Mexico. There was a lot of land owned by Mexicans, so they encouraged marriage and mixing to get access to these big estates and land. So there's a long history of mixing between Latinos, Latinx, Hispanics, and white folks. I also want to make clear that I'm just documenting what's happening, right? I'm not personally saying, oh, everybody should marry somebody of a different race, right? I think people should do what they want to do, but what they shouldn't do is be racist, And I do encourage whites to at least have one non-white friend where you can step into someone else's reality. So I'm not here to say that what people should do. I do tell black women that they limit themselves at their peril if they are determined to date only black men. That that if they open their mind to a range of possibilities, the market might improve and some of these black princes might, act better. But that's another story. I tell my students, don't limit yourself, right? Don't limit yourself, right? I'm an ardent integrationist in this sense, where I do really, I drank the Kool-Aid. I believe in what my boss, Justice Marshall's life stood for. I'm a big advocate for dismantling the structures that separate people and giving people more freedom, more opportunity, more choices in education, in housing. What people do in their personal lives is their business. But the social taboos about marriage and sex and friendship across lines have gone way down. With young people, it's just not that big of an issue. And that has implications, I think.
In the back right over here.
Hi, my name is Jim Bullock. You used the formulation at the end, white Christian nation, and there's another parallel axis going on. You may not even want to go there, but I'd be interested to hear if you have any comments or if they're in your book. You have the racial axis, but you also have the religious axis. And all through the South, your religion, your blacks ended up going to different churches, but they were all various denominations of Protestant Christian. The Ku Klux Klan, when it got going, if I recall correctly, was as much anti-Roman Catholic as it was anti-black. Do you have any, that's a huge topic, and maybe it's not fair to throw it at you, but it seems like it's so much lingering in the background of your story. Maybe you might have some comment about it.
Well, I don't have any particular expertise on that, but I will say there's this theory out there called social dominance theory, where they say that, you pick your country. We have our awful legacy, but the argument is that almost anywhere you go, there is a need for people to dominate other people, and dogmas and theories and stories we tell about people who are ostensibly different are become part of some of the central mythology of nations. So if you go to any place where there is a long history of conflict between different groups, typically there's some of this going on. It just so happens that white supremacy is a big part of our narrative. But it amazes me how people who profess to be Christian participate in the othering of people, and how how people get beholden to some of these dogmas. But I have no particular expertise. I mean, even people who were members of the Klan or being recruited to some of these modern, so-called alt-right supremacist groups, even some of those people, if you read about them, have this feeling or storyline about how they're doing God's work. So there's just a long history of that kind of, I think, exploiting of religion rather than representing the true New Testament, beautiful Christianity of unconditional love and universal human dignity. But that's about all I can say about that.
We have a question here on the side. Microphone will reach you.
Hi, thank you for your words. I very much look forward to reading your book, and I have a million questions for you, which I don't want to bore people with things we can find in the book. Since we have you in the room, I suppose I wanted to ask you more about your philosophical thoughts on political violence. Since Donald Trump's election, there's been a surge in white nationalist groups not just being vocal, but physical, and as a response, anti-fascist groups, and so much discussion around it, people wondering the difference between the two violences, and people realizing it's not equal, they're not the same, they're very different forms of violence. But how much, I suppose through your research, especially in things like integration, have you seen change and pressure and these social structures changing outside of just the law and these important court cases that have taken place, but through people forcing it and being physical about it? And I suppose I'm just wondering how far it goes.
Okay, so violence has a long history in this country. We construct the dogma of white supremacy, and then we have legal means of propagating it. And I alluded to, we had, huge extra legal Klan-backed violence, and then we had mob violence with lynching. So violence is a huge part of the American story of trying to contain people. One quibble I have with the Loving movie is you wouldn't know from watching that movie just how violent Virginia was. They had the Lovings had a cross burned on their lawn twice, right? So violence is a huge part of the story. I am not an expert on Antifa, but I will say that you will lose. I think you will lose ultimately if you play the violence game, right? I believe in nonviolence. I personally would not volunteer to have my head beat in the way John Lewis did. I just wouldn't do it, right? But actively trying to engage in violence, to like take out the skinheads or whatever, the white supremacists. I think that's a marginal game that's ultimately not going to play that well. Just registering to vote and getting great candidates who speak common sense and are tolerant is a better game to play.
I too have many questions, but I'll restrict myself to one historical one. So from the 17th century up until the late 20th century, these phenomena that you described as amalgamation, miscegenation, or in other terms, social equality, seems to be like the raw nerve of white American society, and that you can whip a mob into a frenzy faster by invoking the sex card than perhaps any other card. You know, yes, they're coming to take our jobs. That will get a mob too, but you can probably get one faster and a more brutal mob by playing the amalgamation, miscegenation, social equality card, even at the same time that many of these folks may be, after dark, engaging in their own interracial activities, as you pointed out. Can you talk a little bit about the how and why of the sexual angle being such a powerful stimulant of violence amongst people who in other contexts might not respond the same way? And yet in the public sphere, it is the thing that can draw a white mob, a lynch mob together faster than anything else.
Well, I think that used to be true. I think that the power and potency of that has, for the vast majority of Americans, it's just no longer there. Now, it's still, for whatever reason, I think those people who are attracted to white nationalism, white supremacy, I think there's a teeny tiny subgroup, and so maybe that plays, although I read recently that a lot of people, including, who's the guy who's most associated, what's his name? Richard. Apparently he used to have an Asian girlfriend, apparently quite a few of the guys on the alt-right used to date interracially, at least with respect to Asian women. So I don't know, right? But I think that the power of that bugaboo has been drained, right? I saw an interview again with a white nationalist recently where he said, I don't really care so much about whether people mix. He's more, I think what the recruiting tool is more now about this perception, which is wrong, that an advance for another group means I'm like it's cast in zero sum. So undocumented people are taking your jobs, that kind of thing. So I just don't think it has the power that it used to be as this major recruiting tool.
But once it did, and so could you reflect some on that power, say, in the 19th through early 20th century?
Well, so it's interesting. During slavery, and there's a book, I can't remember the name of it, but it's in the 4th chapter, and I rely heavily on it. A woman who wrote explicitly about black men and white women and sex and all of these, how this got constructed. But during slavery, the perception of black men was although they would be inferiorized, it was more like Uncle Tom, the guy who would protect your children or protect the plantation. And it was a stereotype, but it wasn't this sexual predator, right? And during Reconstruction, people just reached for the thing that would most potentially offend. Interracial sex happened, but it wasn't like most polite society didn't go about doing it in public, right? It wasn't something people supported necessarily, but they reached for that, and it became like this passion play. And I actually think if you read about these pogroms with public lynchings, where they were very often very planned, very staged, very similar every time they're staged, I'm not even sure the people who were doing it ever believed that the black man who's accused was even the rapist. It was just the tool for asserting power and saying, you folks are going to stay in your place, right? So there was a fakeness about it. In the same way, there's a fakeness about a lot of the dog whistling that goes on. I'm not even sure. I'll be careful. Let me not start talking too much about the president, but anyway.
Okay, right here in the center of the room.
Hi.
Microphone.
My name is Claudine Schweber. I have a question that goes partly back and partly I'm wondering the international connections.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talked about the eugenics movement, which I knew some about, that was really a connection to the social Darwinism of the late 19th, this application which you know about. And so it comes percolating, I'm not sure which went first, but I think it was social Darwinism. Today we're seeing some of the same kind of issues around immigrants and darker skinned people, let's just say Europe. Do you see this something coming back and forth because of the economic need that you pointed out? The sense of, you've got more than me, and so in order for this to work in varying countries, just like you were talking about in the US, today this is the international kind of spillover, divide and conquer, because some groups think that they have less and haven't gotten as much out of their environment.
Well, globalization and the competition that comes with that, and there are two things that are really fueling economic anxiety. There's this globalization and all that competition from workers afar who can be paid a lot less, outsourcing their jobs. But there's also technology, with the destructions of technology and innovation. With each generation, there seems to be fewer jobs that humans can get paid a living wage to do. So this is another caution about my, I could be wrong, right? But it's, I don't think I'm wrong, but I could be. But it's just very easy to exploit people's legitimate anxieties. And there's been this cynical move throughout the history of our country. Often, if you look at the rise of Jim Crow laws, it happens at a time when there's some economic dislocations, and you had, for a very brief period, a surge of biracial populism, a biracial farmers movement, and the People's Party for a brief period, upset with what the economic elites are doing with the financing of farmers and all this. As soon as they're showing potential, what happens? You have a reassertion, Jim Crow laws, and handing the white yeoman, the struggling white person, an elevated status, and we just keep doing it. Right? And what I'm saying with my analysis is, I don't have a whole lot of hope of overcoming this silo of between everybody receives their information or their alternate facts from different places. I don't see a lot of hope of breaking up that, but what I do see more of is a growing class of what I call a culturally dexterous person who can see through that BS and rejects it, and can also begin to connect the dots and see the way in which economic elites are screwing people in this country, right? I'm very heartened by Reverend Barber and their moral majority movement and the way they're trying to find, they're not giving up on people, they're actually just trying to change the conversation to talk plainly about fairness. So I'm not sure I'm responsive to your question. I'm just...
I think what you're saying is that we have to be on our guard, because this use of technology, among other things, which is global, is going to continue. And I'm thinking of it only because when I was coming in today, or I heard on the radio about this new supermarket that Amazon is starting in Seattle, is it? I forget where there will be no no human being. You will go in and the computer will check what you're buying or putting back and so on. And therefore, the point you made about loss of jobs would lead to, again, the possibility of finger pointing in it.
Right. So, every generation, like these founding value, every generation has to fight for it. One thing is clear to me. While I think that the coalition, the ascendant coalition for sanity, tolerance, common sense is growing, I think there's always going to be an element that's in this country, there has been from the beginning, that stokes that fear, right? And so I like this, you have to be on guard, right?
But
I would like to call on a woman, a younger person back there.
just to defend technology, please use the microphone. There's a camera back there, and for posterity, you can see this on the National History Center's website, and if you're not using the microphone, there will be like silence. So for the historical record.
Thank you. I am Ji-Won Yang from Stimson Center. I finished my work early to have this seminar, and thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And I have a question that recently, hate expression is so pervasive in cyberspace or illegal rallies or everything. It is a problem in my country, Korea, too. I think hate expression is mostly serious in my country against women, because in my country, men are they only have the duty for conscription. So we have some kind of dichotomy that men think why should we, only us, why only us? And women think then why can't we go to an army? So this is a really historical and traditional dichotomy. So there have been a lot of hate expressions against each other. So I have a question that how can we kind of solve this hate expression? Because in my point of view, it is only able to punish the explicit defamation. I mean, hate expression is a very hard problem to solve, and it is really hard to punish some kind of hate expressions on cyberspace. So how do you think about it? And should we only punish them for explicit defamation, or can we kind of solve it in some cycle?
So, we have the First Amendment, and because of the First Amendment, within reason, people are allowed to say what they want to say. They're not allowed, there are some, I don't teach First Amendment law, right? But there are limits on what the state can do to curb hate speech, right? There's the classic, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? There's certain, but people are allowed within certain limits to say what they want to say. Now, the Fair Housing Act, you aren't allowed to say, I will only rent this place to white people, right? There's certain things like that, right? There are anti-discrimination laws. But I think that the best way to deal with hate speech is to try to cultivate social norms that reject it, right? And that's hard to do, particularly when, you have a president that's engaging in it himself, right? It's hard to do. But, in my kids' school, that's what they do, right? They teach young people how to talk about situations when somebody says something that's hurtful. They try to, you have to create norms of respect. I don't think, you're never going to be able to stop some trolls from saying hateful things online. There may be things that can be done in terms of, the platform, putting pressure on them, to help censor those. But having norms and that encourage people who disagree with hate speech to come forward and say, I don't like that. I'm not going to be part of that. I think that's the best way to deal with it. You know, and it depends particularly on what institution, what context you're talking about. But I think also shining light on hateful speech is the best way of dealing with it.
We have some questions over here. Let's start in the middle and work our way up. Oh, wait, against the wall, right behind you. No, to your right. Then we'll get you. We'll get you. Yes, we will.
Hi, I'm Jalika. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
I'm asking about parasocial relations, however, on a global scale, because you speak of how parasocial relations can really mitigate racism in America. However, American media goes global. So countries in Eastern Europe, countries in Asia and Africa see these relationships on the screen and might reflect it in their minds. You know, do you believe positive positive images of people of color in America could help stop or mitigate racism globally if there's only that parasocial relationship?
Well, it has been documented. It doesn't happen with everybody, but it has been documented. If you depict an interracial couple or a same-sex couple, you know, it tends to normalize that in the sense of, you know, making it more acceptable, right? It is fascinating to me. 5-10 years ago, I struggled to find content where I saw black people who reminded me of myself, my family, my friends, people I know. I now can't even keep up with all the content, you know. I don't have the hours in the day to binge watch, you know. I'm just now getting through Insecure, right? But so there are certainly more in the way of offerings, and it is possible for people to find positive depictions. There's negative stuff out there too, but positive depictions, and get a sense. If you watch Blackness, it is pretty accurate about, you know, it is pretty accurate a depiction of the kinds of things that black people talk about at home, you know, the black people I know, right? In my house, we talk about race every day, you know. I mean, we do, right? So I think it helps. I don't want to be too Pollyannish about it, but it certainly helps to have a broader way of depictions of people of all colors and walks, right? It certainly helps to humanize those folks.
We have a couple of hands here. Let's get two questions together. So this gentleman here, and then we'll move it up, and then you can answer them both together.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm Gary Bodorf. Thank you so much for coming. It was very timely. My wife and I are both from the South. I went to South Carolina when I was a budding college student. And I still remember the shock of meeting her family and seeing the sharecroppers and having a discussion with her father about why the kids should be in school that were out there, the blacks picking cotton. Very life-changing kind of experience. But I have a question for you. We have an interracial daughter now, granddaughter, sorry, and she married an Asian gentleman, and she's at American University.
This is the granddaughter or the daughter?
Granddaughter, yeah,
Okay,
and she's not having any of the problems that I've seen with interracial marriage with blacks and whites. I think we could move the ball if we stopped talking about race and talked about culture, because the culture seems to me to be something that we could change, and then everybody would be able to be more accepting. You know, when I go to like a comedy club or something, the black comedians are so you know what I'm talking about. The language is terrible, and and afraid of white people, of black men, and the violence and all. It seems the culture is what we ought to be talking about.
Can you take the second question, or did you want to respond to this?
If you want me to, it's your show. What, you tell me what you want me to do.
You're the guest. You
Okay,
get to call.
let me just very quickly say, so I disagree with the idea that we shouldn't talk about race. Culturally dexterous people acquire the ability to talk honestly about race. And if we can't talk honestly about the way in which race manifests itself, I don't think we can get past some things, right? Younger people are much better. Part of the problem, and I talk about this in the book, is that for many whites, they've been indoctrinated, and younger people too, in the idea that, well, you're not supposed to talk about race, it's forbidden, you're just supposed to pretend it's not going on. And so a lot of white people don't even have the vocabulary, just profoundly uncomfortable talking about it. And yet, stuff is going on, you know. And actually, I think a lot of whites are getting better at talking about it because, you know, there's stuff going on. You know, I mean, Charlottesville, my God, there's stuff going on. And for the President of the United States to explicitly say that we should be bringing more people from Norway. You notice they didn't deny that. They denied the other vulgarity, but they never denied that he said we should be favoring people from Norway rather than these other countries. How is it that we can't talk about that? That's a problem for the President of the United States to be trading in racism. And if you can't label that and talk about it, and this is what I'm saying, culturally dexterous people, and I feature grandparents. It's interesting. Nothing will force some dexterity on someone before, but most grandparents fall in love. And I feature some grandparents of biracial children that begin to see things for the very first time that they might not have seen it but for this, right? You know, I have one friend who's got a biracial grandson, and he said that he used to not see racial situations. Now he sees it all the time, you know, like, so it's more about understanding people's experience. And I just got to tell you, particularly for black people, black men, they experience race almost daily. And so the idea, and this is the culturally dexterous, authentic friendship, if the terms of our friendship are that I can't talk about race, then I can't share what it's like to be me, right? And it's painful, but, you know. So I disagree with that idea. But that may just be a point of disagreement.
And a last quick question right up here in front.
Thank you. I'm David Sobelson, and I actually have two very interrelated questions. One is the extent to which your book, in its depiction of the history, deals with sexism. And the related question is what you would think of a book with the title Same-Sex Intimacy in America and the Threat to Male Supremacy.
Could you rephrase the question? I'm not exactly sure what the question is. Is there?
It's two interrelated questions. Mm-hmm. One is the relationship of sexism and sex discrimination to the history that you depict in your book. And in a very quick way of saying it, the relationship between interracial intimacy and the threat to white supremacy, and same-sex intimacy and the threat to male supremacy.
Yeah. Well, so patriarchy is definitely bounded up in white supremacy. Basically, what we had was white male patriarchy, right? women were later to becoming full citizens than men, right? Certainly in terms of voting, right? So absolutely, it's very gendered, the whole concept of white supremacy. And when you talk about same-sex, the whole movement toward acceptance of same-sex couples, same-sex couples have a higher rate of interracial marriage or coupling than heterosexual couples. I think in part, there's this whole intersectionality that's people like to talk about, in part because same-sex people who are gay or lesbian or trans, they experience being othered. And a lot of times the people who are doing the othering are the most powerful people. And throughout history, the most powerful people in this country have been white property-owning men. So all I could say is there's something to what you're talking about. And it's late in the day, and I'm mentally tired, and I don't think I've got my...
So that's the note on which I will say there are copies of the book available for sale right outside the door, and I'm going to guess that they can be signed as well.
Absolutely.
Afterwards, so the added bonus. Next week, we have Rebecca Eberling on Rescue Board, the untold story of America's efforts to save the Jews of Europe. Thank you to our audience and participants. Thank you to Sheryll Cashin.
Thank you.